welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I am going to be completing my series on the Najdorf with a quick look at some of the sidelines you might come across, and then a look back through the last glorious 9 lectures that we've done. I'm going to take a quick peek at all of the main variations in the Najdorf that we've covered as well. So to start off with, though, I wanted to wrap up by looking at some of these sidelines that went previously unmentioned throughout the series so far. And to start with, I wanted to start with some strange queen moves that white can play on move 6. So let's get into it here. Of course, the Najdorf arises from e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, and a6. And so, of course, we've taken a look at pretty much all of the main variations now. And what I mean by strange queen moves, well, white has a few options here, such as queen f3, queen d3, and queen e2. And I wanted to take a look at all of these, talk a little bit about why these moves are played, and what the best way to diffuse them is. So to start with, I want to look at what I think white's best option is out of these 3, which is the move queen f3. So of course, the idea of the Najdorf is you would like to play the move e5, gaining time on this knight, and controlling these dark squares in the center of the board. And of course, queen f3 is directly trying to prevent this. Now, of course, if you play the move e5, the move knight f5 is going to come. The point of many of these sidelines is that white has the move knight f5 in case of the move e5 by black. Now, why is this so bad for black? Well, it's sort of playable, but the idea is basically eventually this knight is going to come back to e3, and white's going to be able to control the d5 square very, very fluidly and very easily. Probably, though, he should start with bishop g5, and then something like knight e3 is coming quickly, even queenside castles. So what should you do against this? Well, the downside to playing like this so early on with white is that black has not yet actually played the move e5, and so this move looks a little bit less intimidating if you simply play the move e6, which is what I'm going to recommend. So queen f3 aims to control the light squares in the center of the board, prepares the move knight f5 in response to e5, so black can just play the move e6. Now, if white continues with something like bishop e3, he's just going to get sort of a worse version of stuff we've looked at before. With the bishop on e3, why is this queen on f3? I don't really understand. Black can just develop normally, something like knight bd7, bishop e2, for example, and even the move h5 now to prevent this move g4. So, I mean, this is perfectly playable for white. It's just that it's sort of a worse version of lines we've seen before, where this queen could be sitting on d1 or d2 with the pawn on f3, and then white's play would make a lot more sense. But h5 is sort of important for black in order to prevent this idea of g4 here. That being said, if white doesn't waste time with the move bishop e3 and bishop e2, white is allowed to play g4 in this position. And this is sort of the only line that has any kind of venom as far as these early queen moves go, so you do have to be on the lookout for this one. There are a variety of ways that black can play in response to this, but I like doing what Lenier Dominguez did against an opponent, Rodriguez Villa, back in 2013. And what Dominguez did is just plays this move, knight c6. And I like this move because it pretty much highlights why queen f3 has a few downsides. By moving the queen out to f3, white increases his control over these light squares, but has abandoned this knight, and white is now forced basically to capture on c6. Black can recapture. g5 does come, but the simple move knight d7 is perfectly fine for black, and after some more development, rook b8, black has a nice control over the b file, and always has the opportunity to play d5 at the right moment. In this game, white actually queenside castled, and black continued now with queen a5, and it's pretty clear who is actually the one attacking here. It's not really white, despite playing an early g4, g5. White's the one under a little bit of pressure on the queen side. Just for the sake of example, the game did continue with rook d4, c5, rook a4, So very clearly now, white a little bit worried about his queen side, tried to evict this queen, queen b6, now b3, and black hit him with g6 here, with the idea of fianchettoing this bishop and sort of going for the checkmate. And this worked very well for Lenia Dominguez in this case. The game continued with queen g3, bishop g7, knight b1, queen c7, and this knight arrived on the e5 square. We see rook b4, an opening of the c file, and in the game there were some sort of crazy tactics here, but at the end of the day it heavily favored Lenia Dominguez when after captures, knight a5, or queen a5 rather. The pressure on white's king proved to be too much, and white sacrificed his queen in order to stay in the game, but it was not enough, and Lenia Dominguez did go on to win. So the key points I wanted to highlight here are after queen f3, don't play e5, just play e6, and g4 is really the only line that is critical. If white plays normally with bishop e3, we can develop with knight bd7. By the way, don't play g4 here. Knight e5 would be a double attack. So bishop e2 first, and then we can play this nice move, h5, just stopping g4 in its tracks. And if g4 is played, I like this line with knight c6, captures, g5, knight back to d7, bishop e3 played in this case, and the rook comes to b8 with pressure on the queen side of the board. Okay, so obviously I said there was more than one queen move here. White also has the choice of queen d3 or queen e2, but I don't think these are quite as good as queen f3. Let's look at queen d3 first. Here, once again, the idea is if f5 is played, now knight f5 can be played on the board, and black's typical response of d5 is once again not going to be ideal, as this can just be captured. If we try some funny tactic like e4, queen d4 is actually playable with a check to follow. So e5 not going to be ideal here for black, but once again the move e6 is perfectly fine. Here white should likely try and play a4 to slow down b5. If white doesn't do this, play something like bishop e2. b5 is actually going to be a good move, just expanding on the queen side early on. So a4 is best, I think. And once again, we see knight c6 is a good move for black. Knight takes c6, for example, takes back, queen g3, d5, bishop d3, and g6 was played in a game between Grigori Operin and Boris Gelfand back in 2017. And I do think, once again, this is going to be perfectly fine for black. We see black once again going for the fianchetto here, basically just stunting this queen on g3 that white has spent 2 moves to place. This game continued in this manner. White plays a5 to gain some space, black castled. We see a push in the center by Boris Gelfand, and here black had absolutely no trouble at all in this game with 2 active bishops and huge central control for black. So once again, the remedy to these strange queen moves, queen f3 and queen d3, is just to play this idea of e6, and then in both cases I'm recommending an early knight c6 to try and point out that white should not be spending so much time with this queen when it was serving a useful purpose on d1, defending this knight on d4. If, for example, white declines this trade of knights, plays something like bishop e2, well, now we can take advantage of the fact that this queen has once again moved to a suboptimal square, this time with the move knight b4, also taking advantage of the fact that the pawn has moved out to a4. The queen can't really go this way. We have to keep a close eye on c2, otherwise we could fall to e5. So queen d1 is the main move, and now with queen d3, queen d1 being how white spent 2 tempi in the first 9 moves, black should be doing very, very well here. Can even consider playing the move e5 once again, with knight f5 no longer being a good response, thanks to this idea of d5 coming back again. The last move I want to talk about, as far as early queen moves go, is this move, queen e2. And once again, the idea for white is to take some early control of the light squares. And against the other 2 moves, e6 was how I was suggesting black should play. And e6 here isn't awful for black either, but it does turn out that queen e2 actually doesn't even really achieve the goal it set out to. And black can actually just play this move e5. Why can black play e5 here? Well, after knight f5, there's an early g6 idea by black, knight e3, and all of a sudden it looks like white is achieving what he set out to achieve. But after bishop e6, we still have good control over the center, and this queen on e2 is nothing more than a hindrance for white, interfering with development, and white will have to develop the bishop out this way instead, when he would much rather place the bishop on c4 to help directly control d5. Just as an example game, there is one here between Alfonso Romero Holmes with the white pieces, a 2500 player, and of course the incredible Pentala Hari Krishna with black. And that game went as follows. g3, h5 is actually a really nice idea for black to apply some pressure to this fianchettoed bishop. Bishop g2 and the early h4 by Hari. Castles, bishop h6 now activates the bishop on this diagonal. Rook d1, hg3, hg3, knight c6, highlighting the fact that white is not defending the d4 square very well. And now we see, once again, the queen has to move for a second time in the opening. And this is really why these queen moves early on are just not going to be that threatening. The queen almost always ends up having to move again to a better square. So really, no matter what happens with the white pieces, he ends up spending a little bit too much time moving this queen around in the opening to make any tangible threats. In Hari's game, he did continue just with the move knight d4, and to just flip through quickly, we have knight e2, takes, queen e7, b3, takes, and bishop h3, knight g4. And in this game, queen g5 was played. We saw a queen trade, f6, bishop d2, and Hari was doing all right in this endgame. He did eventually actually go on to win this game, by the way, but I just wanted to highlight these opening ideas with h5 and the early h4 being a very clever way to put some pressure on white. So once again, to recap, queen f3, queen d3, they are very good moves for white if black plays the move e5, because knight f5 gives white a very good position, but black isn't forced to do that, can just play e6, followed by knight c6, putting some pressure on this knight, and then building a big center. Queen e2, the worst of the three options, in my opinion, doesn't even do what it sets out to do, and allows black to play e5 with this idea of g6 and bishop e6 to follow when the bishop on f1 is difficult to develop. h5, h4, another good idea for black there. So those are the early queen moves. Obviously, I didn't go too in-depth on all of these. These are very much all sidelines, so I didn't want to spend too much time. And now I want to talk about what some people may argue is not even a sideline, is just a very common move, and that is the Fianchetto variation. So let me flip over here. Of course, the Fianchetto variation is sort of self-explanatory. We have the opening moves of the Najdorf, knight f6, knight c3, a6, and as expected, the Fianchetto variation involves white fianchettoing. And there's basically two ways that these lines can go. The main way that this Fianchetto variation is played is just not very threatening at all. Of course, the Najdorf, for white to try and get some kind of advantage, the white usually plays some crazy lines like bishop g5 and early f4 and early threats on the center. Or he could play positionally with bishop e2. With g3, you basically get the bishop e2 style positions, but instead, white, of course, puts this bishop on g2 and sort of spends 2 tempi to do it. So usually, these positions not super threatening to black. This is sort of just a way for players with the white pieces to avoid having, it's a way for them to avoid having to know a ton of theory, and they can sort of just get any kind of playable position with pressure on the d5 square. That being said, the old way they used to play this variation actually can be a little bit scary if you are unprepared for it, so I wanted to highlight that as well. But first and foremost, here, of course, the typical Najdorf move e5 is the way to go. This knight can actually step back to the e2 square. If the knight goes to a square like b3 or f3, we end up with positions that are very similar to things we've already looked at, actually, involving bishop e2. so I don't want to spend too much time there, but knight de2 is really the main idea of the Fianchetto variation. We don't mind blocking in the bishop this way because we are already going to put our bishop on g2. Here, the normal Najdorf development is again the way to go. Bishop e7, bishop g2, for example, castles. And here, white should very much consider playing the move a4. If white doesn't play a4 and just castles, well, black can get some very active play with the move b5. And now, in light of b4 coming soon, bishop b7 putting some pressure here, white should immediately jump to the d5 square. We can take this knight, queen takes, and rook a7 is good enough here for black. Why is this position fine for black? We've lost a tempo with the queen on d5, hitting our rook on a8. Well, bishop e6 is going to come with tempo. Black is going to eventually organize his pieces on the c file, and this knight on b8 is going to develop out to d7, eyeing c5 or b6 with more control of the light squares, and black is just going to be doing pretty well here. For example, some normal development would be bishop e3, hitting the rook. Black is happy to play rook b7. And now, generally, white retreats this queen before any ideas of bishop e6 even happen. So queen d3, for example, is my example game. Bishop e6, b3 to stunt this bishop a little bit. Knight d7, knight c3, knight f6, a4 to try and break down some of these pawns. Queen d7, ab, rook a6, rook c8, and black was doing pretty well here in a game between Mickey Adams and Jan Nepomniachtchi, also back from 2017. And yeah, black really doesn't have any problems here. Rook fa1 was played in the game, b4 finally removes this knight, knight a4, and this knight is eyeing some dangerous looking squares, but it's not really so threatening. Queen c7 attacks a pawn, rook a2, knight d7 keeps this knight at bay and trapped on the queen side of the board. And this game continued with queen f1, rook b8, queen d1, h6, bishop f8, knight f6, bishop d7, bishop c6, black getting organized now against this pawn on e4, and capturing it outright, in fact. Bishop a7 was a bit of a mistake by Mickey, rook e8, and black had a very good position here, up a central pawn when the dust settles. And a piece sacrifice actually in this game by Jan, but he gets it back and wins another piece and goes on to win this game. By the way, that game from the Moscow Grand Prix back in 2017. Okay, so that's why white should consider playing a4, because if castles, b5, knight d5, takes, rook a7, ends up in a perfectly fine position for black. Do you have to remember all that theory? No, you just have to remember the ideas. You get some pressure on the c file, you aim for b4, you get your tempo back with bishop e6, and black is doing fine. Okay, let's take a look now at a4 really quickly. This is another perfectly fine way of playing this to try and slow down the idea of b5. But here, there is a downside that comes with playing a4. It's a downside we've talked about before in bishop e2 variations. Like I said, that these variations share a lot of similarities in that they're a bit quieter, a bit more positional. And the downside to a4, of course, is that it weakens the b4 square. And so black's idea should be the same as when we see a4 in those variations. Just shove this knight onto b4. For example, b3. Bishop e6, and black has very good control over this d5 square. White should try and remove this knight from the b4 square with bishop a3. Black can cement the knight here with a5. Knight b5 is a main move, and d5 for black. And actually, the example game I chose featured the move queen d2 and rook c8 first. And still, though, black's idea is going to be an early d5 here. For example, h3, not bishop h3, sorry, but pawn h3, and d5 was played in the game, with black breaking in the center and freeing all of his pieces. So, like I said, very similar ideas to what we've seen in bishop e2 when the move a4 appears on the board. You go knight c6, knight b4, and try to push for d5. Okay, that being said, I mentioned that the old way of playing these positions is a bit more frightening, and rather than these kingside castles or a4 positional lines, which you would most commonly see nowadays, the move h3 used to be popular, with the idea that after black gains some space on the queen side, you're going to run into the move g4, and all of a sudden white is coming after you. But this isn't actually all that frightening. If black were to play slowly with something like bishop b7, well, you might start to run into ideas of knight g3, knight f5, but thankfully with the black pieces, we don't have to play slowly, and the move b4 is a very immediate solution to many of black's problems. Knight d5, for example, takes. And here you actually have the option to play queen c7, but I think rook a7 is simple and also perfectly fine. Bishop e3, and in this case, we can just play the immediate bishop e6. The queen would retreat, and we can put the rook pretty much wherever we like. For example, rook b7 was played in a game between Timofeyev, 2690, and Wang Hao back in 2010, and black was doing perfectly fine here. The game continued with kingside castles, white sort of abandoning the kingside attack now because the situation on the queen side is so open, so volatile, and we saw black get developed, f4, takes, and knight e5. And here, like I said, black's play on the queen side has just come so quickly that white's kingside attack is sort of over before it ever gets started. Okay, any questions on this Fianchetto variation? Because like I said, this is one of the more common quote-unquote sidelines that you're gonna run into. The reason I grouped it in with these other sidelines is that it is very similar to the bishop e2 variation in many ways. And aside from this h3, g4 stuff, it's not very threatening at all. Black just plays normal Najdorf moves, goes for this counterplay on the queen side, and gets developed as we've seen a million times before. All right, any questions on this before we move on? Yeah, Great Wolf says this line feels familiar. That's because it is similar to stuff we've seen. It's very similar. All right. Let us move on then to our third sideline of the night. I wanted to take a look at the move that has appeared in many different variations, but has never appeared directly on move 6. Of course, I'm talking about the move a4. So with a4, white is stopping b5 before it ever gets started. And now this is an idea, of course, that white plays very often in many different variations where b5 is a good move for black, but playing it this early isn't really ideal. There's a reason it's a sideline, and it's because when you commit to a move like a4 so early on, you're sort of giving black a bit too much information about what you're playing for. There's absolutely no reason not to play the normal Najdorf move here. a4 isn't helping knight f5 in some way, so you are very justified in playing the move e5. The knight can retreat to f3, bishop e7, the normal Najdorf development, and now bishop c4 is really the main idea of this a4 variation. But you have likely seen this type of stuff before. Where have we seen this stuff before? Well, let's take a quick look at this move, bishop e3, e5, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop c4. And this is why I think a4 is a bit of a sideline. If you're going to play like this, why are you putting your pawn on a4 instead of your bishop on e3? It's sort of just a worse developing move, right? So the ideas are going to be very similar to this line that we've seen in the bishop e3 variation, except of course white will have a4 played instead, e5, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop c4, and once again the idea is to contest this bishop by playing bishop e6, the same as in the bishop e3 line that we looked at, queen e2, queen c7, the bishop must retreat to c3, and now once again, because this pawn is on a4, black is very happy to play knight c6 with potentially some ideas of knight b4, also some ideas of knight d4 or knight a5 to pressure this bishop a bit. For example, castles, knight d5, bishop d5, e d5, knight b4 was how the game developed in a game between Ilya Smirin and I believe Sinan Sugarov, something like that. Names are hard to say, especially when they're Russian. And black did actually go on to win this game with a very pleasant position here. Rook d1 was played in that case. a5 helps cement this knight on the queen side. c3 makes this knight move away, but now knight a6 is fine. Bishop c2 was played. Rook fe8, h3, g6, knight h2, knight d7, knight g4, and a typical Najdorf idea of f5. Black just expanding on the king side now. And this pawn on d5 really isn't going to be ideal for white. You would much rather have a piece here, as in many other lines. And black is going to be able to pressure it a bit with something like knight f6 in many cases, and can bring this knight over to c5. Just a pleasant position for black. In fact, in this game, white felt that black's position was so pleasant that he should go a little bit crazy and start sacrificing pieces, which is what happened with knight h6, knight f5, and now after queen h5, knight f6, black ended up defending pretty accurately and then had a winning position with the extra piece. Pieces started coming off the board, and here black is fully out of the water and just up a full knight. Pretty good. h5, by the way, played. Bishop f3 takes rook f8, queen e3, knight takes f2, and Ilya Smirin had seen enough with Sugarov winning this game. So that is a4, e5, knight f3. Of course, there are other moves to be played here. There is the idea of knight b3, but in this case, after bishop e7, bishop e2, castles, castles. Believe it or not, we've seen this position before in our bishop e2 lecture, and here the idea is going to be the same. We can simply play the move b6 and develop out along normal lines. Also, I believe actually not bishop e6 here. No, I'm sorry, not b6. It's the same stuff that we've seen in bishop e2, but a4 has been played, so of course I was recommending knight c6, taking advantage of the fact that the b4 square is weak. This is the idea from the bishop e2 lecture, and the idea holds true here because it's the exact same position we just transposed. So that's knight b3. After a4, there's also knight d to e2, but hold on, this is going to look pretty familiar in just a second. Castles, bishop g2, knight c6. What's this? We've seen this before, literally moments ago when we were talking about the move g3, right? Bishop a3, a5 should start looking pretty familiar here. It's the same variation from the g3 sideline. Now, those were all the sidelines I really wanted to devote a lot of time to. I will briefly mention a sideline here, which is going to be a little bit combative. There is the very strange looking move rook g1 to consider, but I didn't want to spend too much time going over every single sideline because there's just so much that you basically can't cover it all in one lecture, and I think it's time to wrap up the Najdorf. Basically, against all the sidelines, if it's a move you're not familiar with, you should calculate if e5, knight f5 is playable. If it's not, then e5 should be your go-to, just like any other Najdorf variation. And then typical Najdorf development is going to be enough for you to sort of survive the day. But with rook g1, of course, there are some early threats of g4, but black, again, can just play this move e5, knight b3, for example. And if you're really concerned about g4, then the move h5 is perfectly fine. If you want to play bishop e6, this is fine as well, g4. And an early d5 is a good way to diffuse this idea of rook g1. You know, white's play on the king side looks a little bit lackluster when you start to realize that black is just breaking in the center and white is wasting his time sort of attacking nothing on the king side. Okay, any questions on any of the sidelines we covered here today? I know there is, more to talk about with rook g1, but I don't want to get too bogged down because I do want to spend the second half of this lecture going over, taking a glance at all of the stuff we've looked at before and talking about that. So any questions before we start to review the last 9 lectures? What's the fallback if e5 doesn't work? Well, if e5 and the problem is white is taking over the light squares with the move knight f5, then the move is e6, right? White spends time controlling the light squares, but you haven't played e5 yet, so you play e6, controlling the light squares. And then generally, I like an early knight c6 in combination with e6, although that's not necessarily important. Also, just try and have a little bit of awareness, because in many of these sidelines, you're going to be transposing into stuff we've already seen, or positions very, very similar to stuff we've already seen. And that's why it's good to know ideas rather than the theory. You also need to know the Scheveningen pawn structures. There are some similarities there, but in general, I think it's more than enough to just know this Najdorf structure with e5, d6. The situations when you play e6 really are going to be rare. It's going to be these weird sidelines with queen f3, queen d3 that aren't very testing, or it's going to be the Sozin, the Fischer-Sozin with e6, right? And I don't think this actually has too much in common with Scheveningen stuff. This is going to be the more theory-heavy stuff where black just sort of tries to get developed, and then later on, black is aiming to play e5 anyways in most cases. So I don't think you need to know too much about this idea of e6, but e7 is fine. Can we take a look at queen c7 and see how things can go badly for white if he grabs the rook? Sure, so we'll take a quick look back at this idea, which was appearing in the g3 variation, right? There's this idea of not defending your rook and going queen c7 instead. And it's not as though this is like a massive trap for black or anything. White can and maybe should capture this rook. Black's idea is just to trap the queen on the queen side with knight c6, taking away this flight square, bishop e3, bishop b7, and wait, let me make sure that, yeah. You can't play bishop b7 here because of queen a7. I was confusing myself a bit. But yeah, knight c6, bishop e3, bishop b7, takes. And it's not really that black is trying to checkmate the white king or anything. It's just a situation where the queen is going to be a little bit more mobile than the two rooks in this case. There's only this one half-open file for the rooks to use, and they're going to end up stunted by this bishop. So the queen is just a bit more maneuverable and a bit better in this position. But you don't even have to bother with this. Rook a7 is perfectly fine for black as well. All right, well then, let's move on. I want to review everything we've talked about. So if my memory serves me correctly, the thing we started everything off here was the Fischer-Sozin. At least that was the oldest study I could find on my profile. Maybe we started with bishop e2. It doesn't matter. We're starting with the Sozin now. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. Maybe I'll stop showing these first 5 moves. You've seen them 8 billion times now. Bishop c4, of course, is the Fischer-Sozin, aiming on this light square diagonal, but because black, again, hasn't committed to e5, white's playing a move that controls the light squares in the center. Black is happy to play the move e6. And then the line I was recommending was a little bit offbeat, actually. We have this idea of bishop e7, and then there are sort of a few different positions that you can sort of get. White can try the typical Sozin plan of f4, f5, but that's actually what this move order is sort of designed against. Black can go for an early b5 here, and if f5, then e5, the knight comes back, and bishop b7. And black is actually doing very, very well in these positions if he finds a really cool idea, bishop g5. And who remembers the really cool idea from the lecture on the Fischer-Sozin? And by the way, it might seem outlandish to get this kind of position with black because, like, if I can level with you, black is doing very, very well here. But the Sozin, on the surface looks very, very aggressive, but at the end of the day, this bishop on b3 is just kind of bad, right? And so black is better in many, many lines. Who remembers the idea? Knight takes e4 I don't think quite works tactically. It's an interesting one, but yeah, we can just take this. If we take here, then knight takes d6 is awkward. So knight takes e4, isn't it? e5 is a rare move. I think it's a pretty common response to f5 in this case. I could be wrong on that. All I know is it's a good move. The idea, believe it or not, is actually this move h5. The point is, this guy is defending this guy, and if he has to move out of the way, white is going to have some pretty significant troubles. And for example, the game might continue. Takes, takes. White has to solve this issue on e4 somehow. If he does so with knight d5, look out for bishop takes d5, and rook c8. And believe it or not, if you flip on an engine in this position, it's sort of minus 1.5. Black is just absolutely killing it with pressure on the c file, ideas of h4 to come, and just the pressure on the e4 pawn is going to be very uncomfortable for white to deal with. Just for example, the top engine line, believe it or not, is bishop b3, h4, knight f1, and taking the free pawn. So it goes to show you a little bit of what white is up against in this variation. By the way, queen d5 isn't so scary. Knight g5, defends f7. Okay, so that's sort of what we're hoping for in this variation of the Fischer-Sozin. However, there are a couple different lines that you do need to be aware of. One is this idea of g4. And here, I believe I recommended the move queen a5. And the point now is black gets a lot of active play against this e4 pawn early on, and the queen can help defend laterally. For example, the move f3, knight f to d7. I actually don't remember if this is what I recommended, but stuff like this. You go for queen a5, and you go for early play on the queen side with stuff like knight c6. Once again, the idea is more important than the actual theory in many, many cases. I actually don't remember this move, knight fd7. Probably I recommended this move, knight c6 right away. But there's this g4 idea I just wanted to briefly mention. There's also the idea of castles, b5, f4. Queen f3 is a bit more common. Queen c7. Now we can meet e5 with bishop b7, queen g3, castles, bishop h6, and knight e8. And once again, we're just going to go bishop b7. We're going to have pressure on the e4 pawn, and black is doing perfectly fine here because this bishop is lame. Stupid, stupid bishop on b3, looking at an e6 pawn. Okay, that's the Fischer-Sozin at a glance. Obviously, if you want to know all the details on all these lines, go watch the Fischer-Sozin lecture. This is just a review. Up next, I wanted to go over, at a glance, the complicated line of bishop g5. Once again, I'm recommending e6, f4, h6 with the delayed poison pawn championed by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and now queen b6. And while this stuff has the reputation of being very, very theory-heavy, very, very complicated, there's really only two main ideas you need to be aware of. There's the idea of a3 and the idea of queen d2. a3, of course, goes down a variation where black cannot capture on b2, but white has wasted some time with a3 and also created a hook for black to sort of attack a little bit later on. And the game here might continue. Bishop e7, natural development, bishop f2, queen c7, stepping off the diagonal, queen f3, knight bd7, developing, castles, b5, developing, bishop b7, and here, of course, the two ideas, bishop g2 and h4. Bishop g2 a bit more common. Now black can go g5 to break down the f-pawn in the center. And some of you may remember this game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Sergei Karyakin, which MVL managed to win quite convincingly by outmaneuvering his opponent, activating his pieces, and winning some material at the end of the day. From, I believe, the London Chess Classic, and MVL goes on to win the endgame easily with d5 when Karyakin resigns. So that's the idea with a3. You go into this variation with white castling queenside, black staying in the center for a bit, and black is doing perfectly fine with pressure on e4. The idea of queen d2 is to accept the poison pawn, and then here, this e5 move is really the only way to apply the most pressure here. If you do anything else, black can sort of get his pieces back into the game. There are some important lines to know, though, so if you want to see those, go back to the bishop g5 lecture. But at a glance, e5, and you go in for this theoretical variation. And this is something you might just have to memorize, unfortunately. And the idea is black has won a few pawns, but after bishop d6, black is going to return the exchange with f5. And from here, knight bd7. And white has a variety of moves, but black's idea is going to be pretty much the same against all of them, With g4, you can first capture this pawn and then trade queens at all costs. Basically, no matter what happens, you trade queens. Castles, queen c5, trade queens. Bishop f3, queen a1 check, rook d1, queen e5, trade queens. Just trade the queens. That's all you got to do to survive this variation, is trade the queens. And that's the bishop g5 move, basically, the delayed poison pawn. Up next, let's take a look at the English attack at a glance. Bishop e3 denotes the English attack. We go e5. Knight b3. We talked about the knight f3 line a little bit earlier in the lecture by comparing it to the knight f3 after the move a4. And here we go bishop e7, bishop f3, bishop e6. The idea is we're threatening d5 if white gets a little bit too careless, so queen d2. And now the idea is h5. And the point here is we have so thoroughly prevented white's kingside attack that he sort of has to give up on it and go for some knight d5 ideas instead. For example, queenside castles, knight d7, king b1, b5, and already knight d5 should be played. We can take, and thanks to our placement of our knights, we can apply pressure here, and white is forced to go in now for some kind of endgame with knight a5, and usually knight c6 when we have equality here. Alternatively, if white wants to be super fancy, after h5, he can give up on this queenside castling, all these ideas altogether, and just play knight d5 immediately. But now we can actually capture with the knight, preserve our bishop, and here, this a5 move is rather important, preventing white from placing his own knight onto the a5 square and getting a positional clamp on us. And then here, black is doing perfectly fine. And yeah. Black is doing perfectly fine is basically the moral of the story here of the entire Najdorf. All right, let's take a look at the bishop e2 variations at a glance. The bishop e2 lines, of course, the more positional stuff that we looked at first, or maybe second, I can't remember. The idea for white is that he's not going after some crazy attack. He's just going to castle kingside and play for d5 control, as in a lot of the g3, bishop g2 stuff we looked at. So e5, still the move, bishop e7, normal development here, bishop e6 to follow, knight bd7, and a4, a5 is probably white's best try for an advantage to clamp down on these pawns. But now a good idea for black to break free is queen c7, rook d8, and breaking out with knight c5. And white very much should be capturing this piece. And then after, for example, takes, king h1, queen c6, black is doing perfectly fine here. This is taken from a game between Vasily Ivanchuk and Luc Van Velde, and I think they repeated very, very shortly in the game. Basically, black is going to play the move c4, take a little bit of extra space, and white is sort of just without a plan at that point. If you want to see the rest of this game, by the way, f3, c4, bishop f1, and here, repetitions arrived. And that was enough for a draw in the European Cup in 2008. Other ideas I wanted to mention for white, there is sort of one tricky line here. We looked at the move bishop e3 when black can play bishop e6. Notably, we're not scared of f4 after bishop e3 because white has taken some time. White can also try the move a4 to stop b5, but now, remember, knight c6, we talked about it briefly earlier in the lecture as well. White has weakened the b4 square, and black is doing fine, and the move king h1 is sort of highlighting the fact that black's response to bishop e3 was bishop e6 because white wasted time, and white's response to a4 was knight c6 because white weakened a square. So now with king h1, white isn't wasting time with the bishop, and white isn't weakening the b4 square. So what can we do? Do we just relent and play one of these moves anyways? No, we play the move b6. The point now being we haven't sort of revealed our plans either. And after the move f3, we go bishop b7, bishop e3. Sorry, not bishop e3. If bishop e3, we can go b5 with an early b4 in response to a4, so white should try a4 himself, and then once again, knight c6, knight b4, and we see the ideas we've seen a million times before, with black breaking in the center with d5. Okay, that's bishop e2 at a glance. And then one more thing I wanted to take a look at a glance is the h3 variation that we went over last week. Of course, this is 6h3. And the idea here is going to be an early e5. Once again, knight d to e2 is the point of h3. And this is sort of this h3 g4 stuff that we've seen in the g3 line earlier this lecture. But the difference now is with white only getting g4 in one move instead of two, I think it is in black's best interest to play h5 here and just stop g4 altogether. And now g3, it should be the backup plan for white, bishop e6, and now b5, normal Najdorf stuff. You put all the pieces on the squares, you play b5, and in this case, knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f5. And if you recall, we went over a game in the previous lecture between Sergei Karyakin with the white pieces when he tried this queen e1 move, and Maxim Vishirlagrov with the black pieces. And black ended up winning this game pretty convincingly with some clever ideas of h4, takes, and as always in the Najdorf, you just always have squares for your pieces. One more idea in the h3 variation. After h5, black is weakening the g5 square, so white could try to take advantage of it with the move bishop g5. Here I like bishop e7 instead of bishop e6, with the point being after takes knight d5, we can get the bishop out to an active g5 square rather than leaving it sit on f8. Just for example, knight ec3, bishop e6, bishop c4, knight c6, castles, and rook c8, and black is doing well here with, once again, all of his pieces having active squares to sit on. And okay, for the last 10 minutes, I wanted to open up to any and all questions anybody has about the entirety of the Najdorf. This is it. This is the finale. I have recapped the last 9 lectures in 20 minutes. I've gone over a few sidelines. Did I miss your favorite sideline? Now's your chance to tell me, people in the live YouTube audience. What if a4 in the English ending? Okay, we'll take a look. So I assume we're talking about this knight to doop doop do. And what if a4 here? Probably just king e7, right? We are evicting this rook. Rook probably has to go back here. And we can even capture this pawn. We're not so worried about this, right? Rook b8. And yeah, I mean, this is just equality all around. In fact, maybe black is the one playing for more. Ideas of a3 to come, for sure. Then rook d2. Okay, I mean, we're sort of just playing a chess game. If you don't like b takes a4, play rook b8 as well first. Black is doing fine here. I mean, this is more of an endgame discussion than an opening discussion. Just trust me, black can do like 80 different things. White can do like 80 different things. It's not going to change the evaluation too drastically. Should be equality. All right. Is that the only question anybody has about the Najdorf? Somebody's mentioning that I made a mistake, apparently. What were we talking about with this knight takes e4 stuff? Oh yeah, we were talking about the Fischer-Sozin. Talking about the Fischer-Sozin. So let's take a look at this again, see if I actually messed up here. Because if I did, it would be important to correct. Not knight takes e4. We talked about that. h5 here. And in this line I mentioned this, and you guys are saying there's bishop takes f7 and queen d5. Is it true? Is it true? Bishop takes f7, king takes f7. I mean, it's true, but like, is it so bad? Is it so bad? I think black is winning. I think black is just winning this position, to be honest. It's tough for white. Just because you see a tactic doesn't mean the tactic wins the game. How to know when to play h5 in general? So that's a good question. We did touch on that topic a little bit during the English attack. So let's go back to the English attack variation in particular and talk about why h5 is played here and why it's not played in other cases. So here, when can you play h5? You can play h5 when white has wasted time with the move bishop e3. And that's 90% of the time when h5 is going to arrive. when this bishop on c1 has already moved once. Why should you avoid playing h5 when the bishop on c1 has not moved? Well, that's because then it's very often a good idea, if I can remember a line when this would even be possible, it's usually a good idea for white to put the bishop on g5, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn is on h5. So when the bishop has already moved once, then bishop g5 is much, much less powerful because white is wasting a full tempo to get it. Now, when do you want to play h5? Well, you might want to play h5 whenever white is thinking of playing the move g4. So even today, we saw in one of these queen moves variation, bishop or queen f3, e6, bishop e2, for example, knight bd7. No, sorry, bishop e3, for example, knight bd7, bishop e2. And here, once again, we played h5 because white was thinking of playing g4. And here, notice as well, the bishop has already wasted time with the bishop coming to e3. The only exclusion to this is this h3 line when we play h5 with this bishop on c1. To my knowledge, in all of the lines I'm recommending, this is the only time you see this pawn land on h5 before white has wasted time with the bishop. And here we do it because h3 is sort of made out to be a useless move by h5. So rather than white wasting a tempo here, this is sort of my justification for it. h3 is almost as useless as just even moving the bishop twice. So that's why I think h5 is perfectly playable here. Other than that, just the specifics work out. There's also this knight on e2, by the way, preventing this bishop from accessing the d5 square immediately. And because of these slight awkward moves, here h5 is playable as well. But this is the exception to the rule. Generally, h5 is bad when the bishop can land on g5 in one turn. But that's an excellent question. Okay. How to punish a premature e5 in the bishop g5 and bishop c4 lines. I can't. I haven't prepped for the Najdorf with white. I don't play one e4. I only know that playing e5 early in those lines is generally bad. I don't need to know why. I just do it because e6 just makes sense. The bishop's on c4, you play e6. The pawn's on f4 in the bishop g5 variation. Well, actually, bishop g5, you don't play e5 because then this pin is awkward and d5 is weak. Bishop c4, you don't play e5 because d5 is weak. It just makes sense. It generally has to do with d5 being weak. Okay, Jonathan has a question as well. What do you do against 6 bishop e2? Let's go to our bishop e2 at a glance here. Bishop e2, e5, knight b3, bishop e7, bishop e3. I don't think this has too much independent value. With castles here, you can just play the move bishop e6. Note, once this bishop moves from c1, we're not worried about f4 because the bishop would waste time by coming to f4 here. And then I think white's best move is castles. If you play the early knight d5, this actually isn't too threatening. We're not worried about stuff like knight e7, bishop g5, because once again, the bishop has wasted time. And I think I did go over this line in depth in the bishop e2 lecture. But basically, yeah, black can castle here, white can castle. Oops, not rook g1, but castles. And we can take this guy off the board. And then I think I mentioned 2 variations here. I mentioned going like rook c8, queen c7, and I also mentioned the active idea of knight e8 followed by f5. Did I cover knight d5? I think, yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, I have a whole chapter in my study about knight d5. I couldn't recite the entirety of it to you, but the basics of it was to start with knight d7 castles, then we play this bishop takes knight, and there's this idea of knight e8, f5 in some move order. Sometimes I included rook c8. I'm not sure if I included rook c8, but knight e8, f5 is the idea for black there. Are there any cases where pouncing on b4 after a4 is not good? Well, chess is always a game of specifics. In general, if you're not sure, I would recommend doing a bit of calculating. If you're seeing some reason why knight b4 wouldn't work, if your knight is actually not going to reach b4 in some position where a4 is on the board, then don't do it, right? Chess is a game of specifics, and you should rely on your feelings at the board, your calculations as well as your prep. Basically, I like knight c6 heading for b4 after a4 in almost every case because it's difficult for white to prevent it. It just really is difficult. And the important things to remember are following it with a5 when your knight's getting kicked away, and you can come back to a6 quite comfortably. Obviously, sometimes your knights are already on d7 when a4 is played in many of the bishop e2 variations that we've seen, and then you just adjust your play, right? You can go a5, b6, put the knight on c5. Just all the ideas. The e-pawn is hanging. Yeah, I don't think the e-pawn can be captured here. I don't remember why. There's some tactic in this position, I'm quite sure. Here, I'll flip on the engine. Yeah, bishop b6. Tough. Tough stuff. How to evaluate when to play e6 versus e5. We've talked about that a little bit tonight already. Basically, e5 is the Najdorf move, and that's what I recommend. e6 is basically always playable. You just get the Scheveningen structures, but e5 is the Najdorf idea. When shouldn't you play it? Well, on these sidelines, you shouldn't play e5 if there's some reason why knight f5 is good. Basically, if white can play knight f5 after e5, you've done something wrong, and you should play e6. So queen f3 prepares knight f5, queen d3 prepares knight f5. I think even the move a3 indirectly prepares knight f5. And in those cases, it makes sense to play the move e6. Other than that, the move e5 should be perfectly fine, as that is the idea of the Najdorf. Okay, I think then I'm going to go ahead and call it here. I know this wasn't our typical Najdorf lecture. We went over a few new things, and then I gave you a quick glance back at everything we've covered so far, and then we had this little Q&A session. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this lecture here tonight. That is going to conclude my coverage of the entirety of the Najdorf. Of course, the Najdorf is such a massive opening. There's always going to be more stuff and more detail that we can cover. But hopefully, if you've made it through all 10 of these lectures, you should have a very good working understanding of the opening, and you should feel confident pulling it out in order to play the opening. I should say the best way, and really the only way to learn openings, is to try them out. Don't be afraid of losing a few quick games because you don't remember something. The best way to learn an opening is to play it. You have to play it. You have to put it into practice. You have to see what people are doing, what you're struggling with. And then hopefully these videos will help serve as a little bit of a reference guide to those as well. Well, that's it. Thank you guys so much for sticking it out with me throughout the entirety of the Najdorf. Be sure to tune back in next week for more chess openings explained when I do something different entirety. If you're watching live, head over to the Twitch channel where I will be going live with Tactics Time. If you're watching the YouTube version, thank you once again. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.